Okay, good evening, good morning, good afternoon, folks, wherever you are in different parts of the world. We have for you another very exciting webinar from our partnership between UMass Lowell and IUCEE. This comes to you from the Jack Wilson Center for Entrepreneurship. And I'm going to just hand this over to Dr. Bill Yell from UMass Lowell to introduce our speaker and take it forward. But as I was having a discussion with both Bill and the speaker, we would encourage you to keep texting, okay? Use your chat, use the questions feature, keep putting as much as you want in there right from the beginning, okay? Over to you, Bill.
Great. Thanks very much, Krishna. Well, I'm very pleased to have Carl Berke join us here for the webinar. Carl and I have known each other for, I guess it's probably about 3 years now. We met when I was an entrepreneur in residence at Mass General Brigham Ventures. It's kind of interesting, though. I sort of followed Carl throughout his career, from his graduate work at UC Berkeley to his work at a medical diagnostics division of Polaroid, all the way to MGBV. So I like saying I follow in Carl's footsteps, including actually becoming a faculty member, which Carl is as well. So a bit more on Carl. Carl's a venture partner at Mass General Brigham Venture Fund in Cambridge. So this is the fund that's associated with the Harvard Medical School system here in Boston. He works specifically on projects being spun out of Mass General Hospital, Brigham and Women's, and Mass Eye. He's also a founding director of Mass Medical Angels, which is a local investment group dedicated to seed stage investment in biomedical innovation. He's spent over 25 years in the practice and management of innovation to bring new technologies from lab to market. He started his career, as I mentioned, as a bench scientist and R&D director at Polaroid and Hygeia. He's an inventor on 6 patents. He's currently he served as a partner at Integral Analysis Group, a management consultancy focused on innovation, and has served on multiple boards as throughout his career. Carl has an AB from Cornell and received his Ph.D. in organic chemistry from UC Berkeley, and he's also an adjunct lecturer in the Harvard MIT Health Sciences and Technology Division. So Carl can speak to things from both the perspective of a practitioner as well as a faculty member. So I'm very pleased to have Carl join us. Take it away, Carl.
Great. Thank you, Bill, and thank you, Krishna. It's a pleasure to be talking with you. I happen to have been in Lowell last weekend for Mother's Day, recreating with my family because we love industrial history and how important this region was to the American Industrial Revolution. So it continues. So I would like to talk with you today about my experiences with spawning new companies, newcos, most recently out of a very rich inventor community that we have in the academic medical system of Mass General Brigham. And I want to talk about sort of a path from invention to venture. Despite what the cliches may say, the world does not beat a path to the door of a better invention. You have to make your own path, and it's a torturous one. It's often idealized, and many people feel the calling, but the investor community and the market says many are called, but few are chosen. We often say that in the lifetime of, in the arc of a venture, a successful venture usually has 2 near deaths before it sees success. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that pathway today. Well, who am I to be talking to you about it? Well, I am fortunate enough to be in the investor team for Mass General Brigham Ventures. We are, everyone says, well, gee, a nonprofit hospital has a for-profit or has a venture fund, and they say, well, it must be, they sort of and a lot of the conventional VCs sort of patronize this and say, oh, it must be nice to have something like a venture fund. Well, we're not like a venture fund. We really are a venture fund. And we are organized formally as a venture fund, and we follow all of the discipline and protocols of a conventional venture fund. We have been at this now. It started as an experiment in 2008 with $30 million that came from the hospital budgets. There's now a $450 million under assets under management across 3 funds that we have raised, most recently last year. We are a large hospital system anchored by Mass General, Brigham and Women's, and the Mass Eye. I should add McLean Hospital to that, our mental health system. And we have sort of a double bottom line mission, kind of a doing well by doing good, where we're focusing on accelerating breakthrough technologies that are, but exclusively ones that arise in our own investigator community. We, to date, have now 52 companies in our portfolios, and we've enjoyed probably about 20 exits, I'd say. The first thing I'd like to do is to make this distinction between invention and innovation. An invention is not an innovation until it's brought to market. And commercialization is that pathway to advance the technology from the bedside in the lab to the bedside. And why is an academic hospital, a nonprofit academic hospital, doing something like this? Because we want to have impact on health, on healthcare and on medicine. Our inventions and discoveries need to, in order to get to the bedside, the only way they can touch a patient is in the form of a product. But hospitals don't make products, only companies make products. And that's why we need to do that innovation, that commercialization step. So another sort of distinction is that invention for an organization is about turning basically grant money into knowledge. Then that knowledge is applied to a product application, it's commercialized, and now only with risk capital, with outside capital, investor money, private capital, can that become an innovation, which is about turning that knowledge that was created with the grant funding into money through commercialization. Often this is a subject of, venture is a subject of great popular interest, and you see it all the way from, the Shark Tank shows on TV. I tell you the truth, I've never even been able to get through a whole episode of Shark Tank because I find it to be so unrealistic and so unrelated to what we do. I think the public, all the way to our own principal investigators, our PIs, romanticize, what it's like to be involved in a venture. They think a venture is a great adventure, but it's really not. I mean, it's a very difficult path. It takes a lot of time and money and emotion and blood and sweat and tears. And I kind of want to give you a sense of what the reality is of that today. I want to stop and also make the point that I'm going to use a lot of jargon today because I'm used to talking to a certain audience all the time that's familiar with it. So I would encourage you to interrupt me either on audio or on the chat, although I'm not sure that I can actually read the chat. So maybe our host can read it to me if the question comes up. But please stop me if you don't understand something, because I don't want to lose you along the way. So we are very lucky to be in Greater Boston because it's we are the hub of the life science industry. We used to be in this sort of friendly rivalry with the West Coast, but I think we've broken away from the pack now. And we have why is this? Because in this area, I think we have an unrivaled combination of factors that make it a perfect ecosystem for innovation. We have these well springs of intellectual property in terms of the universities in our system. The the grant funding that comes through federal government and private foundations makes for a very large research industry with a prodigious output of invention and discovery that we can use, and we mine that to turn that into new enterprise. We also have in the area a very high concentration of risk capital in the form of venture capital group. We don't have to travel very much, unlike other, because we are so co-located here with venture capital groups. Also, though, with surrounding industry, all of the big pharma companies now have something close to have research headquarters here. We have a tremendous concentration of both scientific and management talent. So this is sort of like it's very hard to make a movie outside of Hollywood because Hollywood is so well adapted to movie production. It's the same way here about life science venture. Not to be forgotten is even the legal services that you need to start a company. It's quite specialized and complex, and I would say we are a national center for that kind of legal expertise. We have a whole network of qualified vendors that serve our industry. You no longer have to be companies, startups, they no longer have to, you can do a virtual startup because there are so many of these specialized vendors that can provide the expertise and materials and processes that we need. It's all concentrated. Sometimes it's super concentrated in Kendall Square where our office is. I often can walk to my meetings and it's just terrific. Okay, let's start with why do you think you have a venture? And I think it always has to start with a value proposition. I'm used to dealing with research scientists, and they think that, well, they've developed a new technology, let's sell it. And the problem is that customers don't buy technology. They only buy what technology does for them. So you have to have a very clear articulation, even if you're starting from the beginning. You have to, and don't have a product yet. You have to understand first with what is the problem that you are solving. So even someone like, so Thomas Edison, for instance, he invents the light bulb. We all know about that. I think it was about 1880. The problem was that no one could buy a light bulb because you can't illuminate without electricity. And he was such an unbelievable force that he said, well, okay, we'll also invent the electric grid. And he built the first power station in New York City to create, so that he could create customers to buy his light bulb. So you have to really think about the problem in the context of the market that you'll be working in. When it comes to healthcare, the value proposition is often about better outcomes for patients. Claim is that if we can develop this device, this drug, all the way to market, that it's going to create better clinical outcomes. Well, if that's what you have in mind, you better be able to prove it, and you better be able to envision a clinical trial that's going to support the product claims that are going to be on the label for that product. And that's often difficult for a research scientist or lab-based scientist to do. So it takes collaboration with their colleagues on the practice side. One of the advantages of an academic medical system is that we have both deep understanding of problems because of our clinical mission, and we also have, sometimes they're paired, they're side by side with scientists and engineers who are creating solutions. And sometimes, and that's a very important dynamic between the problem and the solution to be closely coupled like that. And often they're closely coupled in the same individual as the clinician scientist. And that's kind of what I call one of our unfair advantages in our system. Part of the value proposition today in the current healthcare climate is that it needs to be lowering cost of care is quite important. So it has to be a focus on the provider who's delivering that care, and especially on it's a little bit different for drugs. And Bill could probably talk better to me, but better than I can on that. But overall, even if it's a more expensive drug, it should be able to promise a lower cost of care in the long term. So even something like, take for example, I can't remember the name, there was a hepatitis C drug that was introduced about 10 years ago with great controversy because it cost $100,000. Doesn't seem like very much today. That seemed like an enormous price to pay. But overall, what it can do, it saves money to the system because it could avoid a liver transplant at $1 million. And that's the kind of thinking that you have to build into the value proposition. It also has to show your value proposition. Think about what's the customer return on investment. What benefit will they get? What economic benefit can you show by purchase of that product or that offering? It's especially important for capital equipment, instruments in a hospital, for instance, that because they are not explicitly reimbursed by insurers. So it has to be recovered somehow in the margin by more efficient operations in the setting by use of that product. You also have to show a return on investment to the investors, to the capital that's risked for the development of that product. We're going to get into that a little bit more later. Another important consideration in a value proposition is that who is it that's doing the valuing? You've got to make sure that you identify who are the stakeholders and identify who the purchaser is and be able to communicate that benefit to the purchaser. So, for example, if you if you want to offer a superior surgical instrument, is your customer the surgeon or is it the hospital that manages the OR? It's really about the hospital, about the OR administrator. Certainly have to please the surgeons. The surgeons can request and they can advise, but the purchase decision is made by the hospital. And a lot of companies miss that. You want to be talking up front. I guess another piece of advice is that when you're considering a new offering, service or product, it's got to fit into the existing workflow as much as possible. You don't want to have to do what's called what I would call an evangelical sale, where you've got to really change what asking for a major change to what physicians and hospitals are used to doing. It's a big lift. So as much as possible, you want to understand that context and fit into it. I'm going to talk a little bit now about what does it take to form a company. I call it nucogenesis. And for us in the kinds of, in the genre of investing that we do, it's about IP, intellectual property, and science. It always starts with the science. That's the foundational asset of a new company. And then once you have that science, you think about, well, gee, is it time to start a company? Well, not so fast. The company formation, the actual formal company formation, is not necessary until you're getting close to finance, because premature commitments in a company can really become problematic. All it takes to say that you started a company is to send $75 to the Delaware Secretary of State for incorporation. But that doesn't mean that you've got a company yet. There's so much. So there's another reason to delay is, especially if it's coming out of an academic environment, is to try to utilize the sponsorship of the granting agencies and the host institution to bring the tech to further develop the technology and de-risk it as much as possible, so you can maximize you can maximize the value to investors and by additional de-risking that you can do with non-dilutive capital. A critical step, and I'm going to talk about this in more depth, is to hook up with an entrepreneur. If you're a scientist or an engineer, you've got your skills, but you need to also respect the skills of the business founder for the company, and you need to identify that person, and early on in the process to be able to create that business plan together. That means upfront agreeing upon founding ownership allocations on the common stock. This is before financing, and that will avoid problems later, or let's say confrontations later that comes when you're starting to deal with actual investors. I also recommend as early as possible to engage a venture attorney. These are lawyers that have the specialized skills for doing company startup. There's a lot of them in Boston, as I mentioned, and often you can finagle these attorneys to defer their fees and do the work, what I call on scholarship, where they'll have plenty of work, especially on the first financing of the company. And this way they sort of go at risk in order to win you as a client. Part of the new company formation process is to initiate the option and license process on the intellectual property. So often there's a patent that's going to be the central asset, and institutions, including Lowell, have technology transfer offices that are very skilled in the handling of intellectual property and the licensing to companies. I'm going to defer the discussion about capitalization and valuation a little bit later, but to say that it is a very fraught subject. You know, when you are dealing with investors, it's an arm wrestle, and the value of the company on that first financing is in the eyes of the beholder. Oftentimes with business students, you all learn how to do your fancy calculations for net present value, discounted cash flow based on peak sales. But for us as VCs, that's just speculation heaped on conjecture. And we can talk a little bit about how you actually arrive at valuation in the real world. So let me talk a little bit more about the entrepreneur. What we strongly preach to our inventors is don't try to do this yourself. Scientists and engineers should respect the business skills of the entrepreneur manager. And venture capitalists don't invest in technology. They don't invest in science projects. They invest in teams and plans. And that's the job of the entrepreneur. Big ideas, they don't have their own legs. The world does not beat a path to the market, does not beat a path to their door. You need an entrepreneur to develop the story for VCs, to fundraise, and to build the team. And you can never underestimate how difficult that fundraising process is. And it is not very compatible with the life of an academic engineer or scientist. What that means is that you're really giving up your child for adoption, your brainchild for adoption. And it's very difficult to give up that control to your co-founding entrepreneurs and to your investors, but it is essential in order to advance the prospects of the company. We often sort of joke, but it's not really a joke, that founderitis is the leading cause of death of emerging companies from our system. And we, good entrepreneurs have lots of choices, and if the founding scientists and entrepreneurs are too difficult, they'll find another opportunity that's not so difficult. So what we preach is that the inventors need to treat the first CEO as a co-founder, not as a hired gun. And how do you find that person, and how do you compensate them? Well, initially there's no, you need that person to find the financing, but you don't have financing to pay that person. It's kind of a conundrum. And so you need to find entrepreneurs that have the right phenotype to be able to take that risk. And Professor Yele is one of those people. These are, they work for basically sweat equity. That comes from this co-founding allocations that I talked about before. So we have, how do you find these entrepreneurs? Well, it's through networking. It might be through the publication of the science, might attract investors and entrepreneurs who are scanning and maintaining awareness in the area looking for an opportunity. And we try to enhance that we run an entrepreneur in residence program, and that's how I met Bill. And we sort of regard that we provide a small stipend. It's enough. The stipend is enough to show our commitment, but it's not enough to pay their mortgage. So they're highly incentivized to find an opportunity. We sort of think of them as jockeys, and they're looking for their next racehorse from our stables. And we are basically giving them a hunting license to find an opportunity and ride it out, and leave us as entrepreneur and become the first CEO for that company. In the process of meeting investors, what do venture capitalists do? The first thing they do, and if you can engage their attention, and that's your entrepreneurs, the entrepreneur's job might be your job as future entrepreneurs taking this course now, and they go through what's called the due diligence process, and it's based on the principle of trust but verify. The business plan lays out. I'm going to tell you all the dimensions of consideration for planning a business, and those have to be pressure tested. All the assumptions, all the assertions that you make are going to be tested. And one of the most important principles in that process, I tell to aspiring venture entrepreneurs, is no surprises. You do not want to oversell any of you don't want to oversell, because a good venture capitalist is going to discover the ground truth. And if you lose that trust, the VC looks at you and says, well, what else didn't they tell me? So the diligence process is a very, it has to be a very open exchange, an honest exchange. Venture capitalists are risk takers, but they want to understand that risk as much as possible. I have to, for me to obtain financing, I have to appear before a investment committee, and it's really quite an interrogation, and the process of that interrogation often reshapes the plan that we're doing, because you are dealing with very experienced buyers in a way, and they bring a lot of experience to bear, and you can learn a lot from answering their questions. I guess a comment or piece of advice I make is that we spend a lot of time talking not to the company founders, but to in the field. I mean, it's one thing you can sit and theorize under the olive tree in your lab or your backyard, but what really counts is getting out there in the field and understanding how your target customers and users would regard this this theorized product. So this whole process can take 3 to 6 months. It seems like a long time for inventors, but that's really what it takes to go through this process, and it requires a lot of input from both the business and the scientific founders. Let me pause there for a moment and see if there's any questions. I can't see you on my screen, so it's a little bit hard talking into space.
No problem. I will be watching out for the questions here. Carl, I've not seen any questions yet. I would encourage everybody in the audience to start chatting the questions, and I'll be reading them out as needed. But right now, I don't see any questions.
Okay, good. So maybe somewhat randomly, I'm going to segue in here and talk a moment about patents and when patents are very important for most life sciences companies, with an exception that I'm going to talk about in a minute. And so intellectual property is about patents, and a lot of people it takes a while to appreciate what a patent is really all about. A patent, people think it's the right to produce and sell your own invention. It's actually not. It's a right to exclude others from practicing your invention. And it seems like a distinction without a difference, but it really is. So there's this concept called freedom to operate. So let's say you invent the pencil, and this is a description of a granted first claim on a pencil. It's called the Thoreau Pencil Company. Then let's say that pencil is introduced, and there's a user comes up with the idea, well, you know, we could improve that pencil by putting the eraser right onto the top of the pencil. Then you don't have to go looking for the eraser when you need it. And so that's a great idea. That's a big improvement to the pencil. So this is you can file a patent on that improvement. So the question, sort of a trick question, is which company, the Thoreau Pencil Company or the Superior Pencil Company, has the right to make and sell an eraser-tipped pencil? And the answer is neither company has that right. In order to be able to produce that improved pencil, you need the basic rights from the Thoreau Pencil Company. So Superior would have to license from Thoreau in order to have that right. And for Thoreau, they cannot sell any pencil that they, even though they own the rights, with an eraser, unless they were to license from the Superior Company. So that's this concept of freedom to operate, and that's a big part of diligence, is understanding the patent rights. The exception I was going to tell you about was in digital health, software and apps. We in general don't even we don't even go to the bother of investing in the patent application and prosecution, because it's very difficult to protect code, even if it's copyrighted. A slightest change to the code means that it's not on copyright anymore. So usually for digital health, there's the protection on the intellectual property asset is not formally patent. It has to come from know-how. It has to come from, I would say, first mover advantage, and the momentum that you have of a company by getting into the market first. In fact, some people say that, you know, I have made this mistake a number of times in my companies where there is an outrageous challenge, an infringement challenge, and you go after that infringer, and it can bankrupt a company. Some people say that a patent is the right to go bankrupt by defending your patent rights. You really want to try to get the strongest patent you can to, I'd say, ward off litigation, and then, but to the extent you can possibly settle or avoid litigation, that will save you from, well, litigation is often called the sport of kings because it is so expensive. I'm not going to go through this, but
We've got a couple of questions if you want to take them now.
Yeah.
Okay, so the comments that we have is this is from Raju Dando. When you talk about accelerating technology, what is a reasonable timeline from invention and risking? Invention to innovation. Sorry, from timeline from invention to innovation.
That's a very good question, but it's not a reason. It's actually not a very good question. It's not a reasonable question. It is entirely contextual. It depends on the field that you're in. It depends on the strength of the technology, the difficulty, what will be the development pathway from what does it take to get from the concept to the product. So for something like a drug or a vaccine, the regulatory process is daunting and can easily be 10 years. Whereas you're talking about like a modification to a surgical instrument, which is lightly regulated and you probably can't get a very strong patent for it. It's probably not a very big market, but it might be it's about a short pathway to be able to find maybe be able to find an acquirer in the terms of an industry supplier that has a big catalog, and this would fit into some white space in that catalog. That could be very short. So I would say,
so follow up. Yeah. A follow-up to that is, how do you address the loss of control fear factor when dealing with venture capitalists?
Sometimes we do the best we can. We try to advise and counsel by example, but we try to provide, I'd say, some peer advisors, especially for academics, someone who has been through that experience before, that's been starting from the same place as the inquirer. But I'd say sometimes we are not successful with that, and that's what leads to this founderitis. And I've had many heartbreaks where I've put an awful lot of time into something, but then at the end of the day, we can't really separate the invention from the inventors. In order for a successful tech transfer to occur from the lab to the company, you really need those adoptive parents to be, you need their advice and counsel along the way as well. So we can't, even though our institution might own the patent, because it's assigned by the inventors to the institution, we can't really license out that patent in a way that's hostile to the inventors. So if we can't gain their trust, the company is basically not going to happen. Sometimes the inventors think they can just do it on their own, but as I said before, I've almost never seen that happen.
Okay, let's take one more question and then move on and take the other ones later on. Can everyone be an inventor and subsequently become an innovator?
I'd say not really. We find, as I was saying before, that you need the Sometimes, but you need the specialized skills of the scientist and of the businessman. And usually, if you're going to be, usually you can't do both. In order to, and so it really does take a collaboration. Um,
Okay, so why don't you keep going with your slides, and we'll come back again to a few more
okay,
questions.
great.
Yeah,
Okay,
sure.
so I wanted to provide here, this is just an exhibit for your reference maybe. This is a rubric that I developed for genericized for looking at business plans in healthcare. And these are on the left side are kind of all the different topics that need to be covered and that will be diligenced in the process. And on the right side is a little bit more drilling down a little bit on what the questions are that support those topics. And you don't have to answer every one of these for every deal, but if you, there's a different weighting and emphasis for different deals in different contexts. But if you make an attempt to answer these questions, you'll be in pretty good shape with a business plan for talking to VCs. I want to say a minute, talk for a moment about what the VC kind of philosophy is about portfolio. You know, the VCs are looking for high returns on investment. Why does it have to be so high? Well, the reason is basically because the winners have to pay for the losers. And every deal that we do, we're always excited about them, and we think it's a sure thing. And every inventor thinks that they have a beautiful baby, but believe me, they don't. And one thing that I have learned in this business is that all that I know is that I don't know. So if you do, you know, this is result of doing a little modeling, where if you've got 10 starters in your portfolio, and typically takes 5 to 7 years, let's say, for an exit in a life science company. I'd say out of those 10, 2 of them are going to reach that 5x ROI, which seems so high. And most of them are going to be either meh or complete failures or write-offs or, you know, bankruptcies with a fire sale of the IP assets. And so in order to get a target portfolio return, you've got to really have some home run multiples in there. And that means that every deal that you do has to look like a star on the day that you invest, and because you know that they're not going to be. And I often will tell when I have to go up before the investment committee, which is like a firing squad, and I get interrogated. Sometimes what I have to say is, well, this company will probably fail because those are the odds, but because of my diligence, I can't tell you why it's going to fail. So I've tried to identify every unknown and mitigate that to the extent possible, but it's the unknown unknowns that kill you. So that's why you've got to be able to have a very attractive potential rate of return. Talk for a minute about sources of financing. I'm a VC, and I prefer but I'm also, you know, an angel investor myself, a personal investor. And, you know, given the choice and I have, you know, I come from a community where a lot of network connections and friends who are starting companies. And my preference is always to go for VC funding. It's not always easy to do that, but the reason for that is because VCs can provide a lot more than money. They have, but besides deep pockets, they bring the patience and relative experience of doing this many times before. They have the risk appetite for it, but they also often have domain expertise, which is quite valuable to the management of a company. But before you get to that VC stage, there are lots of other sources, starting with what they call friends, fools, and family. That's the walking around money that you need to be able to attract money. It takes money to get money, to be able to recruit the business collaborating founders to be able to court investors. It does take some walking around money. You can talk to angels. I'm involved in an organized angel group called Mass Medical Angels. There are also wealthy individuals and family offices that might have some particular interest in your area, and some of them are organized into groups. And these can be very useful. Some of the angels are experienced and professional, but those they're small amounts of money, usually less than $1 million. That can be very useful for the seed stage and getting things going. In my opinion, it's the preamble act to get to venture. Then there are the broker dealers, and this is the buyer beware, in my opinion. These are kind of banker types, and they raise money for a fee. Now, they have their function in the ecosystem, but they are, and it is regulated. They have to declare that they have to file as broker dealers, and there are SEC regulations on that. And typically, though, they are these small. We're not talking about Goldman Sachs here. These about more individuals, scrappy players and firms, and they solicit entrepreneurs because they make their money from fees, but it doesn't seem like the fees are very high, but oftentimes broker dealers overpromise, and it's usually kind of a poison pill for VCs who will really have usually the small broker dealers don't have access to the kinds of funds you need and on the timeline that you need to get all the way to market. So I say beware there. Increasingly, we look for strategics, which are industry players like a big pharma company or a med tech company who wish to they're looking to fill their pipeline with emerging technologies. They can't do all the discovery themselves. And so doing equity investments in startup companies can give them a sort of a courtside seat in a game that they want to follow. It's important and strategics are an important signal for other investors to say that, wow, the market is validating this with a real player who knows the customers. Working with strategics, though, can also be dangerous because big companies reorganize every few years. Every time there's a change of CEO can bring a change to the product development plans for the companies. They change their therapeutic areas, and new brooms sweep clean, and they will suddenly lose interest and not want to do any more follow-up investing in the company that they started with. So they're not as reliable, again, as the VCs. The last thing I'll mention is non-dilutive financing. What that means, dilutive financing is the kind of when you're selling shares and equity to investors, but companies can also receive grants. So the SBIR program, the STTR programs, which are run with NIH and NSF, are extremely important in the ecosystem for venture because they will provide grant funding to companies and not require any share ownership in return. It can also come from non-government organizations like Gates Foundation, Juvenile Diabetes Foundation, Dementia Foundation, who have focused interests in areas and will provide both actually dilutive and non-dilutive grant funding, but also dilutive funding as well. JDRF, Diabetes Research Foundation, was a pioneer in this area where nonprofit funds go in to support, let's say, a high-risk company, and they will take shares and in the hopes that if there's a return on it, it goes back into the fund, like it does into our hospital fund to support other projects. Let's talk for a little bit about valuation. Valuation is this negotiation that goes on when you are selling you're doing the first financing of your company, first equity financing of your company. So how much do you sell the shares for? That's based on the valuation of the company. So as I said, everybody thinks they have a beautiful baby, but that's in the eyes of the beholder. An asset is only worth what someone is willing to pay for it. The kinds of early stage opportunities that we're talking about is only a promise of a future revenue stream. And there's no revenue, and there's no tangible assets with a market price like a commodity product. So pre-money valuation is pre-money is the value is the proposed share price to the first investors. It's a highly fraught subject. And the way that VCs really look at it is based on comparables, on market comparables. What has been there? What are valuations for other companies that have been founded recently in related areas? And as a newco, you're a price taker, and the investors are the price makers. So to the extent possible, you'd like to have an auction going where you've got competition for investing in your companies, but it's difficult to get there. So I often say that a fair price is when both sides are unhappy with the share price that you reach. And the reason valuation is so important is because it's going to determine how much of the company the founders are going to own after the first financing. And investors are going to want control of the company. So they want to be able to get as much ownership of the company that they can for the investment that they're willing to make. It's important for this goes back to the question before about founderitis. The founders of the company will have their own interests in mind, but investors are really more fiduciaries for the company. They want what's best for the company because as representing all the investors, whereas the founders of the company may often diverge from that. So there's a lot of arm wrestling over that. So I thought maybe what I would do is talk for a moment about an example of a company that I think Bill is familiar with, and I'd be able to give him, because he was an important advisor to me when we started this company. It comes out of Mass Eye and Ear, and so it started with the problem. The problem was the experience patients have, and my guess is you're too young to have gone through this yourself, but someone in your family may have had retinal reattachment surgery. So this is where the retina comes off the back of the eye and can cause blindness or blind spots, and it's repaired by basically a sort of a laser welding technique. And the problem is that it's a very successful surgery, but only if the patient has to adhere to a very burdensome post-surgical process where they have to remain prone face down 24 hours for 7 to 10 days. It's very difficult. You have to buy a special, you have to rent a special bed to sleep in to be able to maintain that position. And that's because what they do is they put a gas bubble into the eye so that when you're face down, the gas bubble floats up and applies some pressure to the recently retached retinal tissue to the back of the eye to promote healing. And so it's a big market with 250 million of these surgeons, 250,000 of these surgeries done a year in the U.S. But it's very onerous. So the idea was, well, what if we could? The reason you have to put so you put the gas bubble in into a space which has been vacated by removal of the vitreous humor. So that's the first step in the surgical process. So the idea is, what if we could make a hydrogel to replace the vitreous humor? That way, that would be a natural way of pushing the maintaining a close contact of the retina, recently detached retina, to the back of the eye. The problem was that this has been attempts over 100 years to try to find that hydrogel replacement. And it's a very, very difficult problem because the material, it's a thick viscous gel and has to fit through a tiny needle to get into the eye. So the gel has to have a chemistry that will, so it does not gelate until it's already, injected into the eye. And then the gel has to be non-inflammatory, has to be non-immunogenic, and then it has to be able to disappear after it's done its job naturally. So it's quite a long laundry list of requirements. So we had a couple of retinal fellows. So these are basically medical students in training. They were in the retinal service at Mass Eye and Ear, and they were MD PhDs. And however, they weren't polymer chemists either. So they went out and sourced a candidate technology and worked with some consultants, and in their role as researchers at Mass Eye and Ear, and came up with a prototype formulation. Did a series of demonstration experiments. This is under grant funding. So they're creating intellectual property here that's owned by the host institution, the Mass Eye and Ear Institute, and the patent was paid for and filed and prosecuted by Mass Eye and Ear. But it got to a point where these scientist entrepreneurs said, "Gee, we think this has got product potential." This many have tried before and have failed. This time is different. We've understood why they failed. We have specifically addressed those areas of failures to come up with an innovative solution here. So formed a company. We raised $17 million for that company in 2018 in a Series A financing. We actually started with angel financing. So this is kind of an unusual situation for our institutional fund, where we did accept a project that this company had been started with a small amount of seed financing from angels, and then graduated to this venture syndicate that we recruited. The device has a long regulatory path. It's called the pre-market approval. It's regulated as a drug because the primary action is mechanical, not drug, and so the FDA regulates it as a drug. There were a lot of challenges along the way, and I'm going to come back to that. But let me cut to where we are now. We are now in clinical trial in Australia. We have treated a pilot cohort of patients with very positive results. So we're seeing patients with rapid restoration of vision while they were fully ambulatory during the healing period. But we encountered some problems along the way. So I would say we've got another at least 2 years ahead of us. We have to make some modifications we've done already to the method of administration of the gel in order, again, to fit into this physician workflow. We also experienced some unanticipated adverse events. The animal models were not, mice are not men. And despite the amount of preclinical in vivo work that we did, what we experienced in the clinic, that there was some intraocular pressure elevation that had to be addressed in the patients that would have been a safety signal. We've now done that, and we're back into the clinic again, and we're also going back to the well for more investment, which is quite typical. So maybe I will sort of end with a couple of comments.
Sure. Yeah.
Your question? I'm not ending yet.
Go ahead. I think it's time to wind up, so you might want to wind up. And in the last slide, you can put your email ID in case people want to send you questions.
That'd be great. So I'm going to say that you're at a stage where, say, no matter what stage you are, it's, as Aesop said, it's better to be wise by the misfortunes of others than to create your own. So to the extent possible that you can learn from prior experience, that's part of the research that you'll be doing and that your investors will be doing. The other point I'd like to make is, let's, going back to what our roles are as scientific founders and business founders, we regard the scientific founders as the mothers of invention, but they need to regard their business co-founders as the midwives of inventions. It's our job to bring these inventions and discoveries to the market so that they can benefit patients, and it takes a collaboration to do that. Okay.
Okay, fascinating, very fascinating presentation, and actually very nicely, simply explained, Carl. I really loved all the way you presented it, but unfortunately we don't have time, so I'll give this back to Bill Yale to make closing comments. Go ahead, Bill.
Well, excellent. Well, thanks very much, Carl, for a great presentation. For those of you who have questions, please feel free to reach out to me directly, and I certainly can forward them over to Carl. Hopefully you got something out of his presentation. He came to this with a very unique perspective, I think, being a part of a unique venture fund associated with a major institution, and his honesty, frankly, his overly honest perspective on things is I think very, very helpful. And just in planning for our next webinar, we have a webinar coming up on June 16th. Jose Godinez from UMass Lowell will be joining us, and he will be providing us a presentation on social entrepreneurship as a tool for development. In many cases, I think we tend to focus on purely economic benefits of venture and entrepreneurship, and I think Jose's discussion on social entrepreneurship will be eye-opening for many of us who participate and attend these panels. And with that, we'll close the panel for the day, and thank you very much again to Carl for attending this and providing a presentation, and thanks to all of you in India for staying here so late, and thanks to everyone here in the US for participating as well.
Okay, thank you, everybody. Stay happy, stay safe, stay healthy. Okay, take care,
Thanks,
everybody. Thanks.
Cheers.